a nossa segunda live já, né? Não dá pra chamar de reaction? Dá pra chamar de reaction, dá pra chamar de watch party. Eu chamo de assistir uns negócios bacana com gente bacana e trocar umas ideias. Bom, temos aqui já inscritos do canal e também apoiadores, nos ajudam a escolher o conteúdo. E hoje nós estamos pegando o nosso segundo mais votado, um documentário sobre Steve Ditko. Esse documentário ele foi produzido pela BBC 4, né, lá da BBC de Londres, e ele é do ano de 2007. Esse documentário ele gira em torno do jornalista, né, o responsável pelo documentário, que ele vai se apresentar aqui no início, eu não estou recordando o nome dele. Fã do trabalho de Steve Ditko, ele fez um longo levantamento sobre a carreira de Steve Ditko. Ele coloca o Stan Lee na berlinda, inclusive, sobre uma história bem interessante, a gente vai lembrar aqui também. Eu tô lembrando vagamente, como eu disse, eu já assisti esse documentário há um certo tempo atrás, e tem alguns aspectos que eu vou relembrar com vocês aqui. Eu acabei até reassistindo ele quando em 2019 eu li o livro do meu amigo Roberto Guedes sobre o Steve Ditko. Vocês vão perceber que Steve Ditko era um personagem não, vai, ele era um sujeito bem controverso. Vocês vão perceber isso aí. Me mexi aqui, pronto, agora deu.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Ross. The documentary you're about to watch means an awful lot, to me at least. It's probably the most personal program I've ever been involved in, and it deals with a subject that I find intensely fascinating, compellingly important, shamefully unexplored, and largely undocumented. It deals with the history of comic books and the history of one comic book character in particular.
Lembrando que isso aqui é uma das nossas comemorações de 60 anos do Homem-Aranha.
That's Spider-Man, of course. I have very little doubt that you have, at the very least, heard of him. He's very famous. Spider-Man is one of those handful of fictional creations who is instantly recognizable the world over. An entertainment brand worth billions of dollars to the company that own him, but not, of course, to the men who created him back in the early 60s. In fact, of the two men most directly linked with the creation of Spider-Man, one of them receives hardly any credit at all, has accepted no money from the millions of dollars generated by the movies and the endless stream of merchandising that accompanies them, and lives a modest, intensely private life in New York City.
Gostaria de dizer que vai ser contundente esse documentário. Ele é de 2007, ô Tunani. Os que não assistiram esse documentário saibam, ele é bem contundente, tanto que o jornalista que é fã do Ditko, tem um momento de plot twist aqui que ele põe o Stan Lee na berlinda. Entre outros momentos bem peculiares e depoimentos sobre o Steve Ditko.
He's never given an in-depth interview to anyone. He hasn't really spoken about the creation of his work ever. And yet his artistic talent and brilliant body of work have probably given me more pleasure in my life than any other person working in any of the entertainment industries. His name is Steve Ditko, and I'm going looking for him.
Antes, lembram da live que eu fiz sobre o documentário do Kirby, né? Que eu comentei de um original que eu tinha visto do Kirby em 2018. Nessa mesma área dos originais do Kirby também tinha originais do Steve Ditko, originais esses da década de 60, expostos lá no Sindicato dos Ilustradores. E meu amigo, ele desenhava no tamanho A2 as páginas. Ele desenhava maior do que o A3. E não só isso, amigos. Ele desenhava em cartolina ou papel cartonado. Vocês conseguem imaginar isso? Muito doido, assim, os originais enormes. Tudo com tracinho de bico de pena, cheio de detalhe. Quando tu olhava no gibi, né, impresso, tu já ficava horrorizado, assim, com a escala da linha. Então, realmente, era uma disciplina, assim, no original absurda. Então, eu vi aquela página em preto e branco, eu acabei lembrando e queria falar pra vocês. Vamos lá. Tá.
This is one of only 3 or 4 photographs of the elusive Steve Ditko known to exist, and trust me, I've spent an inordinate amount of time searching for others. Why? Well, I'm more than just a little bit obsessed by his work. Ever since I first saw his art, I was hooked. More than any other comic book artist, his work stays with you. It is far more dramatic, far more insanely imaginative, and far more personal than it needs to be. His style is unique, and from the little I know about him, his life seems just as unusual and perhaps as strange as his work. Although Spider-Man is probably Ditko's crowning achievement, he'd worked in the comic book industry for many years before that character first appeared in 1962. And he continued creating bizarre and colourful characters for many decades after he stopped breathing life into everyone's favourite wall crawler. But Spider-Man is still the one character that fans return to. Now, Spider-Man was different. He was about as far removed from the chisel-jawed adults like Superman and Batman who previously dominated the scene. Spider-Man was a character that puny, bespectacled comic book fans like me could directly relate to. Superman was an all-powerful alien. Batman, an orphaned multi-millionaire who lived above a cave filled with jets and cars and shared his life with a young boy in tights. Nice work if you could get it, but clearly fantasies. Spider-Man, on the other hand, was a puny, unpopular teenager who lived with his old aunt and uncle and endured the same kind of hell every day at school that most of his readers did. We loved him because before he had the good fortune to get bitten by a radioactive spider, we were him.
Esses dados levantados por ele no início do documentário são bem peculiares. Ele fala sobre criações e os trabalhos registrados de Steve Ditko. O Aranha, sem dúvida, é o mais popular, tanto temos aí esse personagem gerando muita grana. Ele já inicia o documentário incisivo, dizendo que muito desse dinheiro não foi para os criadores, em especial o Steve Ditko. E ele comenta sobre essa gênese do Homem-Aranha, que é o quê? Que é o personagem adolescente, tendo as suas dificuldades, inseguranças, mas acima de tudo, sendo um super-herói, com superpoderes, e não um sidekick. Comentado por ele do Batman com o Robin. A gente também tem que lembrar que antes de Homem-Aranha nós tivemos Shazam, que era uma síntese entre o leitor, a sua faixa etária em si, com a figura do protagonista. Então, assim, obviamente, tu tinha uma mudança, o personagem era uma criança, se tornava o adulto. O Peter Parker, o Homem-Aranha, já era diferente. Tu tinha ali um personagem adolescente que tinha superpoderes, mas ele tinha todas as dificuldades da vida de um adolescente. Então, você poderia fazer o paralelo com o Superboy, que foi, inclusive, desenvolvido ali no final dos 40, começo dos 50? Poderia, mas é o Super-Homem, ou seja, uma versão adolescente do Superman. Então tem um bocado de facilidades, e isso não havia, evidentemente, no Homem-Aranha.
My love of comic books goes back to when I was a kid. This is me enjoying one of my favorites back in 1969. Although actually, I wasn't really that cool. So you're going to have to go, mate. I was more like this. Come on in. Yeah, enjoy that. And like some kids are obsessed with sport and others with taking
Eu era
photos
com o cabelinho lambido.
one down the States before inevitably enjoying a short stay at Her Majesty's pleasure. I lived and breathed for the joy that these cheaply produced four-color epics.
Eu posso dizer que com certeza essa aqui não é uma Amazing Fantasy número 13 original, né? Eles não iam estar com o treco assim todo desbeiçado. Fizeram um facsímile, com certeza.
Gave me. Although to be honest, I wasn't able to afford this one until I was about 30, so I'm going to have to take that off you, and you won't see that again for over 20 years, mate. You might think I'm alone in my adoration of Spider-Man. You might think that I am somehow socially or emotionally retarded to still have such great passion for something aimed essentially at children and created almost 50 years ago. But I am not alone. I begin my quest to discover more about Steve Ditko right here in London. Isn't that a great cover? Look. Now, the easily upset among you might wish to turn
Mark
away.
Miller.
You see before you three grown men indulging themselves in their passion for comics in a room I have at home dedicated to those four-color masterpieces.
My name is Paul Gambaccini, and I am a Steve Ditko reader since 1960.
Paul loves the early Spider-Man books as much for the human drama they contain as the superheroics.
It's the ultimate soap opera. It was really probably the first soap opera for us that we ever were exposed to. They had personal problems. They weren't just invulnerable heroes who had a weakness such as the color yellow or green kryptonite. These were characters whose problems were they loved an old woman who they had to support, Aunt May in this case. What made Ditko's Spider-Man so different was that these problems were the problems that the audience had. He was in high school, so he had to struggle to get good grades, but after the murder of Uncle Ben, he had to earn enough money to support himself and Aunt May. So he's the breadwinner. Plus he's a student, plus he's a superhero. Oh my God, how do you do all three?
Pacote completo. O Ricardo comentou aqui o Causos do Elvis, Causos das Histórias em Quadrinhos, que é um quadro que eu tenho lá no canal do YouTube. Eu fiz sobre a influência do Capitão Marvel Jr. na vida do Elvis Presley, né? Aí ele comenta que, né, o Ricardo lembrando desse Causos, né? Ele deixa claro como essa relação com o personagem jovem com o leitor da mesma faixa etária é impactante. Hoje em dia, né, a gente pode ver isso aí, por exemplo, com muitas séries populares, e eu prevejo que isso vai acontecer com a série da Miss Marvel, com a Kamala Khan estreando no Disney+. Eu acho que vai gerar um retorno assim para uma nova geração que até nem conhece essa personagem. E o Homem-Aranha, ele é muito desse início, desse movimento dos adolescentes querendo ler adolescentes com os seus problemas dentro das histórias.
Just like Paul and myself, Mark Millar is also a big Ditko fan. And in 2004,
Mark
he
Millar,
realized his dream of becoming the first and
2007
thus far
o
only
documentário.
Brit to write the
Foi um
Spider-Man
pouco
series.
antes ou depois de
When I
Guerra
did
Civil,
Spider-Man,
hein?
the only stuff I read as research was, the Ditko run, because to me that was the heart of it. It was the seed that was planted. That's now Spider-Man. Everything that made Spider-Man.
Esses inglês desses escoceses é foda, cara. Pá. Vamos lá, vamos tentar ajudar vocês e vocês me ajudam.
It was about everyday stuff, and nobody for me epitomized that more than probably Ditko, I would say.
Cara, tá foda.
Although
Pra
Ditko was
definir. Mas ele tá
responsible for the
comentando que o
art,
Aranha
the man behind the
era um
script
adolescente
was the
feio, né?
legendary Stan Lee.
Basicamente.
Although together they only produced less than 40 Spider-Man adventures, the huge impact they had on the comic book industry is undeniable. But just as Spider-Man's popularity was beginning to soar, helping Marvel to become the #1 company in the business, Steve Ditko walked away from the character without a word.
Falando do aspecto do desenho, Steve Ditko, ele cuidou da arte do gibi do Homem-Aranha, todo o seu run, talvez salvo raríssimas exceções, em que ele fez desenho e arte final. Então, vocês viram no início do episódio, eu falei dos originais em tamanho A2. Saibam então que todas as 23, 25 páginas do gibi mensal tinham desenho e arte final, talvez salvo raras exceções, que o Steve Ditko tenha feito os lápis e outra pessoa feito a arte final. Isso mostra o quão dentro das histórias do personagem o Ditko fazia questão de estar, né? A ponto de até um determinado momento, a gente vai ver isso daqui a pouquinho, o Ditko simplesmente começa a ignorar vários dos apontamentos do Stan Lee, assume as histórias, assume a rédea das histórias sozinho. Praticamente o Stan Lee tinha que improvisar os seus diálogos, né? Em cima de escolhas que o Ditko fazia da história, que muitas vezes iam contra muitas das coisas que eles tinham combinado antes. O Styles Mack, o Peter do MCU, não teve essas coisas que encantavam as HQs. Concordo. Por isso que precisou, né, dar uma, não diria repaginada, uma reorganizada, né, no Peter do MCU.
On the comic book industry is undeniable. But just as Spider-Man's popularity was beginning to soar, helping Marvel to become the #1 company in the business, Steve Ditko walked away from the character without a word of warning. Of course, there have been rumors, there's been speculation, there's been gossip, but Steve Ditko has never spoken out about why he walked out, and not knowing still drives me a little bit nuts. To unravel the mystery of Steve Ditko, I need to delve deeper into the world of the comic book creator. So I'm going to meet some of the most talented and opinionated people working in the comic book industry today, in the hope that they can offer me some insight. In my opinion, there are only a handful of comic creators who really deserve to be considered masters. Steve Ditko is one, Jack Kirby another, and Stan Lee, the man they both worked with for many years, a third. But if I were forced to offer an opinion as to who is the greatest talent still working in comics today, then I wouldn't even hesitate. His name is Moore, Alan Moore, and like me, he's a Ditko fan. But unlike me, he chooses to live and work in Northampton. I've had my jabs, Northampton, here I come.
Nesse momento, um abraço pro Gustavo Browner, nosso colega de podcast, que já tomou sorvete com Alan Moore num pub, só pra lembrar.
Along with Frank Miller, Alan Moore is widely regarded as one of the saviors of the modern comic book. He released Watchmen in 1986, reinventing the graphic novel with its dark and twisted view of humanity.
At Overston Park, Northampton, the Caravan Club holds its annual rally with hundreds of caravans from all over the country, and it's an ideal holiday for the kiddies. Now, I wonder what's behind that screen.
My name is Alan Moore. I am a comic writer and magician living in Northampton.
Não precisa dizer quem é, né? Por favor.
I probably first encountered Steve Ditko's work when I was 7 or 8. I probably wouldn't even have known that it was Steve Ditko at the time. There was a kind of elegance, a tormented elegance to the way that his characters stood, the way that they bent their hands. There was something even in the 9-panel page grids that he used to habitually use that brought a kind of claustrophobia, a kind of paranoia to the work. His characters always looked very highly strung. They always looked as if they were on the edge of some kind of revelation or breakdown. There was something a bit feverish about Steve Ditko, and I pursued my love of Ditko well into adulthood, and it became a kind of low-level addiction. And there was something about the way that Ditko handled a superhero in Spider-Man, which made it a feature of the urban landscape. In Superman and Batman, buildings were just to be flown past. But as with Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko brought this quality to his cityscapes that had real character. It was a slightly paranoid and shadowy character, but that suited very much the kind of introspective, often melancholy mood of a lot of those early Spider-Man episodes.
Evidentemente, no documentário está muito bem ilustrado, né? E o Ditko tinha isso mesmo. Tirando os quadrinhos que ele fez posterior ao Homem-Aranha, principalmente ali no final dos anos 70, começo dos 80, tu tem o trabalho do Steve Ditko com uma diagramação bastante, como o Alan Moore mesmo citou, claustrofóbica. Tu tem os quadrinhos todos autocontidos. Evidentemente, não havia tantos painéis com fundo expandido, mas os personagens que tinham características fortes, mas que podiam desabar ali justamente com medo, sabe, com incertezas. Então, tornava os personagens que ele fazia bem humanos, né? Isso aí o Alan Moore salienta bastante.
New York was an inspiration for Ditko. In 1953, he moved there from a small mining town in Pennsylvania and made it his and Spider-Man's home.
Here comes the Spider-Man.
And it was here that he joined the cartoonist and illustrator's school. I went uptown to meet his mentor and teacher, one of the true pioneers of the comic book industry, Jerry Robinson.
Well, I guess I'm best
Jerry
known in
Robinson
the
estava
comics
vivo
for
também, né?
my work on
Criador
Batman.
do Coringa, porque não
I was
sabe.
one of the three original team. Of course, one of the notable contributions, I suppose, is the creation of the Joker.
Remarkable.
I have some permanent.
Here we have some of Jerry's covers here. Look at that. That's got to be the definitive.
A lot of fans like that one best.
I love
don't
this
know
one.
why.
Of course, that's a classic image.
First one.
Jerry taught Steve in the 50s, and even then he noticed Steve's phenomenal ability.
Well, he was serious about the art. He was serious about learning. He was dedicated to learning. He was dedicated to becoming a storyteller, a visual storyteller.
As part of the course, Jerry would find work for the students in the industry.
I wanted to introduce the artists to doing professional work as early as possible. That's the best way to learn, is to...
Jerry Robinson está comentando aqui, caso você não saiba, Jerry Robinson chegou a ser professor de desenho. Ele tinha um curso que ele pegava justamente os alunos ali que tinham um grande potencial, ajudava eles, né, para conseguirem os primeiros trabalhos. Evidentemente, o Jerry Robinson botava alguns deles para trabalhar no seu estúdio, né, depois que ele trabalhou por anos, né, com o Bob Kane. E o Steve Ditko foi um dos seus alunos mais célebres, né, e ele está comentando sobre esse período que o Steve Ditko foi aluno dele.
Well, he was serious about the art. He was serious about learning. He was dedicated to learning. He was dedicated to becoming a storyteller, a visual storyteller.
As part of the course, Jerry would find work for the students in the industry.
I wanted to introduce the artists to doing professional work as early as possible. That's the best way to learn, is to do something and then see your work in print and having to do something of professional standards.
Jerry hooked Steve up with Stan Lee at Atlas Comics, soon to become Marvel. Although Mr. Ditko hasn't worked full-time for any one comic book company for decades now, I felt my search wouldn't be complete unless I visited the home of his earliest triumphs, Marvel Comics in New York City, where there are still some who remember working with Steve in the early days. Although today Marvel is a multi-million-dollar organization, back then when Steve joined in 1956, there were just a handful of artists. Notable amongst them was the great Jack Kirby, widely accepted as the most influential comic book artist of all time. And of course, there was Stan Lee, writer and editor-in-chief.
Say hello to the fans, Flo Steinberg.
Hello, fans. It's very nice to meet you.
Hello, I'm Flo Steinberg, and I
Flo
had
tava
the
viva
distinct
ainda.
pleasure of working for Stan Lee at Marvel Comics from
Ah,
1963.
cara, tem que ter aquele comentáriozinho, né? Importante, porque isso aí, se é verdade, se não é, assim. Você já leu o Homem-Aranha do Steve Ditko e do Stan Lee? Você já viu o visual da Betty Ross? Betty Brant, não é Betty Ross, perdão. Agora digam pra mim se não é parecida. Flo, que era um amor, sabe, muito, muito educada, muito, muito sorridente com todos os artistas, sabe, muito prestativa. Tava sempre ali para facilitar, né, a ponte entre o Stan Lee e os leitores. Pois é, ó, o Rod Tunani falou, tá igualzinha, né? Pois então, né, cara? Vamos chegar lá, nós vamos chegar lá, aguenta aí.